Hi there, and welcome back to the Energy Sector Heroes podcast. My name is Michelle Fraser, and every week I will speak with incredible people who share their lessons, experiences, and stories from their time spent in the energy sector. Hi there, and welcome back again to this week's episode. If you're new to the show, then please take a second to subscribe and even consider sharing the show with one other person. This week I am joined by Tristam Horn. Tristam is the CEO of Centrset. Tristam, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much, Michelle. As teed up there perfectly, Tristam Horn, and currently the CEO of Centrset, a new startup to develop some niche well construction technology.
So how did you get started off in the energy sector?
Yeah, so 2010, I graduated with a master's in engineering from Newcastle and came up to start in the energy industry. I joined BP as a drilling engineer. Fantastic base for learning all about the well construction industry. So did some work here in the North Sea. Was fortunate enough to go and see some operations in West Africa and what was then the Gulf of Mexico. Came back to the UK and did a few years doing various different well construction operations for BP in both the sort of North Sea basin and the West of Shetland basin. And then in 2015, the first kind of downturn that I'd really seen in oil and gas came about, and everybody was talking about cost efficiencies and new ways of working, and we've got to get smarter. And that's where I guess I started my career in the entrepreneurial space to go and try and solve some of those challenges. But yeah, that's kind of how I kind of got started in energy.
So was it always a conscious decision for you to, after leaving university, to get into the energy space?
Yeah, it was. I actually remember impetus being my grandfather, where he had said, you always need to be in an industry where you're supplying something that people really need. And energy is obviously right up there as something that people really need. So I think that was probably the impetus. So yeah, I think it was always there on the cards.
Okay, so you've travelled a lot in your career. Where's the most interesting country that you've worked in?
Good question. There's nothing quite as remarkable as home sweet home. I love it up here in the northeast of Scotland, and whilst I've dotted about the world and experienced different cultures and ways of working, I would say there's no place like home, and would answer that Scotland.
So, I agree with you as well, because I've travelled quite a bit myself, but there is something really special about Scotland and Aberdeen, I would say. How do you think that the career is going to look like for the young professionals, especially in drilling, going forward?
So it's a good question, because it's certainly not the kind of glitzy glamour that it was when I started in 2010. But having said that, well construction isn't necessarily going to cease with the sort of traditional energy industry that is, hydrocarbon exploitation. Wherever there's a hole in the ground for various different reasons, be it for exploiting geothermal energy or be it for storing carbon dioxide in CCS applications, there will always be a well construction industry. So I feel like there's actually maybe an opportunity right now for young people coming into the industry whom might feel like on the face of it, there's this kind of political vilification of the industry. But there are actually still significant opportunities. We've got both East and West Coast operations going on in the UK for drilling operations to store CO2 underground permanently forever. We have geothermal applications for well bores. So it's not just for hydrocarbon exploitation that we go and put holes in the ground. So I wouldn't say just to knock it on the head on the first kind of glimpse on the basis that it's oil and gas and a dirty industry. There's still plenty to do.
Drilling in a hole has it's a nice job, but it's quite seen as quite dangerous. Is it quite dangerous? Because you're right up there in the forefront of the action.
Yeah, and I think that question was probably getting a more shifting answer round about when I sort of maybe started coming into the industry, or even maybe slightly before that. yes, it was a historically dangerous job. However, with shifting cultures, with shifting technologies, fewer people have thankfully been exposed to some of the more significant risks, that can cause long-term harm. However, there are always risks, right? You can never get something down to zero. And I think nowadays, whilst we're fortunate that in the industry, many of those safety concerns that have maybe been more kind of visible, injuries and risks to humans, we're probably now looking more at the less visible risks and damage that humans can suffer as a consequence of being away from families for a long time and being in what are cabins and not enjoying the kind of beauty that we've got at home in Scotland by nature and open spaces. And I'm talking more, I guess, about the mental health challenges that people that are away from their families for extended periods of time suffer from. So, yes, it's a industry that has got human risks, but I think we're doing a good job of recognizing those and building mitigations in to try and be as conscientious and empathetic to the workforce as we possibly can.
I think we have as well. I think the way that we're drilling has changed a lot. What has changed actually in technology with drilling? Yeah, what's changed in the drilling technology?
Yeah, like I mean, even in my relatively short career in the industry of just 16 years, first rig I worked on was a relatively manual rig, in so much as there were still quite a few people on the rig floor, for example, putting on manual tongs. It was an older rig, now been taken out of service, but a 1973 Aker H2 semi-submersible. So it was a relatively old rig even when I was working on it in 2010. Nowadays, when you go onto a rig, it's you can actually trip drill pipe almost with nobody in the rig floor, thanks to a lot of the technology which has been built into the rig floor, like hydrorackers and automated tongs and automated slips for the rotary table. So there's a lot of good technology which has been able to pull people out of the red zone. Some of the more kind of niche operations where it's been more challenging to pull people out of the red zone, where you're rigging up pieces of pipe and so forth. Actually, one of the pretty awesome pieces of technology which the company which acquired my previous company have been developing and working on over the last 10, 15 years is a piece of technology called the Black Hawk cement head, which is trying to, again, take people out of the red zone at these dangerous moments of the operation by developing technology which enables for sort of mid rig floor makeup of the cementing line, which historically has been a very manual process where people have needed to be in danger zones, but people are being more conscientious and innovative when it comes to creating technologies to try and pull people out of dangerous situations, which is really, really great to see.
I do think that if some of our younger professionals graduating maybe this year, what would your advice be to them if they're seeking a job in drilling or yeah, in drilling?
It'd be to say no to nothing, say yes to everything in terms of being out there, socializing yourself, networking, just trying to understand whether or not it is for you. Because, I think it's fair to say that if something isn't for you, there's no point pursuing it. You really got to go and try and find your passion. And I think if people do go and do that, then they're going to lean into something that they enjoy and they're passionate about, then they're always going to excel. So yeah, that would be my advice, is to just go and feel it out, see what you think. And hey, if you like it, great. You're going to be successful in that, be that drilling or anything else. But no, I would say, go out and try and socialize within the industry and go and speak to people that have been operating in that industry for a short period and a long period. Get a feel for the whole sort of spectrum of how people have enjoyed what otherwise working in the industry to gauge whether or not you feel like it would be for you.
I mean, you don't really see apprentice drillers. How would you get your first foot in the door with a big company?
Yeah, and it's a valid observation, I would say. 10, 15 years ago, during the kind of heyday, I suppose, of what was oil and gas, yeah, we were where I was at BP, we were taking 10, 15 graduate drilling engineers in annually, and that dropped off obviously significantly post 2015. And you can see that in terms of now I'm in the entrepreneurial space, so I do a lot of kind of business development into that community, and there is a visible kind of, I guess, gap in that kind of 5 to 10 year, even sub engineer kind of level, because yeah, absolutely, there's been a big drop off of individuals joining the industry post 2015, 16, 17. However, there are still individuals that are coming through graduate schemes, albeit not at the same magnitude of individuals, in terms of quantity of individuals rather, whom are going through those, but they do still exist. I see ones and twos of people joining operators whom are on graduate schemes, right? So they, whilst they're maybe not quite as prolific in terms of quantity, they do still exist. And I think it's just a case of, keeping your ears to the ground and reaching out to those companies that do provide well construction services if you want to kind of get into that industry. And that would be the advice in so much as if it was to go that direction. I guess the other direction where people have ended up being in that industry is through the service community, where you've joined the providers of services to well construction operations. And by getting exposure to those, there's a natural progression to being able to, be involved in that whole kind of well construction process, be it from a kind of drilling services or a casing running services or a cement placement services or a rig provider. There are still rigs dotting about that require people to go and operate them. Therefore, people will still be required for the foreseeable. So, either through the operator kind of community or through the service provider community, there are still inroads into the industry if people wish to go and explore that avenue.
I agree. I think there is still opportunities for the young professionals to explore whether they were wanting to go into the well services industries or down the more traditional drilling. But is it still an exciting career post 2015, 2016?
Yeah, I think we've got quite a culture of innovation within the industry. People are always developing new ways of working and thinking about solutions to challenges. So I think that there is some excitement there. You're never going to get away from the fact that it doesn't have that glitz and glamour of it, $120 a barrel when, the rest of the United Kingdom was suffering economic downturn and house price fallacies, and we were kind of protected from that up in the northeast, and it's the table's very much turned, of course, now. So yeah, sure, it doesn't have that glitz and glamour, but there is still excitement, right? There is still opportunity. I feel like we do have an entrepreneurial flair within the industry where people want to go and create solutions to challenges, and for me, that's the draw, right? That's the excitement. That's what I've really kind of like leaned into in the last decade. So naturally, I'm obviously biased in that direction, but I've saw a huge amount of excitement and challenge out of it, which has been good fun. So my short answer would be yes, but caveated with you've got to enjoy that, right? Because if you don't, then go and find someone else that you do enjoy.
You mentioned earlier that you do business development. That's quite hard to do. That is.
It's the hardest thing to do. Yeah.
What
you're trying,
yeah,
what you're trying to do there is you're trying to sort of change an individual's perception of how something should be done. And I'm talking about business development in new ways of working, right? And innovations. You're absolutely right, Michelle. Very difficult. You're spending a lot of time influencing and trying to build the sort of technical substantiation as to why a certain technique is superior to an alternative, and trying to change people's understanding and thought process as to how they should be operating. Because naturally, it's always easier for somebody to just to copy the last way something was done. But by doing some type of influence to try and demonstrate that there are alternative, better ways, it is very, very difficult. You are right.
How do you approach it then?
Softly, to be honest, actually. And it's more about, again, trying to find the individuals that are open to it. Frankly, if somebody is not open to considering an alternative technique or a way of working, there's no point wasting their time. Very importantly, in my own world, wasting my time in that or my team's time in that. So, first step is to find individuals that are open to improving their processes and ways of working. Once you've found those individuals, which generally is quite a small portion of the population, we're talking probably 20 to 30% of the population, the large majority of people will simply not want to change, which is fine. That's the way that humans are, and humans have always been and always will be, which is fine. But you've got to go find those individuals, and then once you've found them, it's a case of not being overly pushy. It's a case of really kind of working with them to fully understand and quantify their problems and challenges, to understand, right, does our solution really address that? And is it going to actually be a worthwhile change? And again, you're probably not talking about the entirety of that population. You're talking about a proportion of that population again, because some of them, they just won't have a big enough challenge to warrant changing. But then once you found them, it's then a case of, like I say, quantifying the challenge with them, working very closely with them to show that commitment that you are right next to them as they're going to be implementing a change to their processes and inevitably facing challenge and scrutiny within their own organization as they lobby for that change, which is very, very challenging. So that's the kind of I guess success recipe that I've found work in terms of business development for new technologies and innovations and new ways of working over the last 10 years.
What are the common challenges that companies face just now?
In well construction, I mean, the very, very high level one is to try and make an operation economically viable. We've got fiscal headwinds here in the UK, but they're not wildly different to challenges globally. There's it's a global market, and so high level trying to get economic viability on a project is kind of first and foremost. But when you start drilling down into that, there's always a lot of risk in well construction operations. So from a challenge standpoint, it's about trying to engineer that risk down to as low as feasibly practical, because that will naturally then spill over into a lower cost operation and a more economically viable overall project. And the technology which I'm currently working on stems from some risks which I've seen over my career in well construction operations when it comes to actually installing pipe. This is just one example, right, in terms of the full spectra of risks that face well construction engineers. But installing pipe is not often as straightforward as it can be in other applications. And when I say that, I mean like drag of actually putting the pipe in the hole can mean that you either need to spend more time to install it, or sometimes you can't even install it at all. And then you're in a significant non-productive event, which translates into a significant cost overrun or addition of cost that you ultimately need to recognize as less economically viable for the whole project. So the technology which we're developing at Centrset is designed to try and address that by making it lower drag as the pipe is being installed, but still offering the opportunity to go and deliver the required zonal isolation objectives for that section. So that's what I would say is a big challenge broadly within well construction, i.e. economic viability. But we're trying to address that, I guess, industry-wide through technologies, innovations, which go to minimize those risks to maximize economic viability.
Okay, and can a company maximize their economic viability?
They can, they can. Like, I mean, certain geographies around the world are more fortunate than others, in so much as they maybe have different sort of fiscal regimes, or they just have different reservoir characteristics or drilling characteristics that make the operation naturally more economically viable. I guess the changing parameter within that spectra is the fiscal aspect. The UK 15 years ago had quite a different fiscal regime, and we had a very, very buoyant industry as a consequence of that, right? Because we've got naturally very favorable God-given formation characteristics that make the hydrocarbon reservoirs that we have in the UK very favorable to delivering the gas or oil that's demanded on the kind of global stage of traditional energy, I'd call it. However, that's balanced out by the fact that we now have a less favorable fiscal regime. So, when you look at that elsewhere globally, there's maybe areas of the world which don't have the same formation characteristics or have increased drilling challenges, but they've maybe got substantially more favorable fiscal setups. And actually, when you balance all of that together, it therefore makes the kind of global stage of an energy operator decide that, yes, we can deliver economic viability in projects, just not here. It has to be over there. And therefore, they, of course, will, they've got a business to run. They have legal obligations to their shareholders to maximize value. So, they will pick the most economically viable opportunity to go and exploit. Now, that's taking it through the lens of hydrocarbon exploitation. Of course, there are alternative reasons for well construction, like we were discussing at the start. CCS is a perfect example, right? Economic viability of capturing carbon, liquefying it, storing it underground will have its own economic viability. So you run the business model. I've got to go put a wellbore in the ground. Got a customer who's got some carbon dioxide that they want to store and put underground forever and benefit from the fact that we're not polluting the environment, or needing to go and offset that with carbon credits or planting trees or some alternative solution to that challenge. And again, we need to be able to go and kind of create an economically viable business model that's going to mean that we're going to go and do this project rather than an alternative. So, and we're seeing that, right? We're seeing that those are options that customers are taking, and that might well be through, kind of again the balance of fiscal setups and technical setups. Technically putting a hole in the ground is what it is in certain areas of the world. Fiscally, are there subsidies? Are there tax breaks? Are there tax burdens maybe, which will mean that whole mix needs to be evaluated, and then operators and customers will make the decision that's most economically favorable. But by the fact that there are ongoing operations, my kind of layman's take on it would be yes, there are economic viabilities to these operations and projects to continue.
Okay, because is a lot of companies in the UK still drilling then?
Yeah, there are. Yeah, there's the continuing, but no doubt shrinking of the traditional drilling industry within the UK, where you have the Aduras, the Neonexts, Pluses, the Ithacas that are still putting holes in the ground to kind of continue the infrastructure that's kind of there to keep them ticking over, because naturally there is a demand for it. There's no doubt about that. Nobody is saying that there's not, albeit we're not sanctioning huge new greenfield projects anymore. It's more just about kind of winding that part of the industry down. But there are, like I say, the sort of newer well construction industries that are upcoming with the CCS projects. We're considering one up here in Scotland with Acorn. There's a much more mature one with NEP down in offshore Teesside. There's one on the west coast off of Morecambe Bay with the E&I project. So yes, there are drilling operations ongoing still in the UK, albeit of course just not at the scale that it was historically. Okay,
so if you could give a new graduate any advice on how to build a successful career in the energy sector, what would that be?
So I would say it's to, first and foremost, present yourself professionally. LinkedIn, in my view, is becoming more and more paramount in that. The kind of business to business social media platform. It's the first place that I go whenever I look at individuals. And so I would say, to make sure that is well polished and authentic. I would say you need to network yourself as fruitfully as you possibly can. So yeah, it's about taking a bit more of a shotgun approach and spreading it far and wide. You're not going to be, you might get lucky if you target a specific conversation, but it's you're going to have a more successful opportunity if you maximize your spread, I would say. So a professional approach, make yourself look good, access as many areas as possible, and first and foremost, make sure that is something that you want to do. If it's not something you want to do, you won't succeed in it. So you've got to be sure in yourself that it's something that you are feeling passionate about and want to do.
So if you could turn back time, would you change anything?
Man, that is it's pretty deep there, Michelle. But would I change anything? Like, I mean, everything is a learning opportunity, right? So even the instances where you think, oh shit, I should have done that differently. I think it's actually builds character. But would I have changed anything? Oh, actually, yeah, I do. I remember one which, as a graduate, it might be quite. This might be but again, I've got two answers to this. So I remember as a graduate at BP when Bernard Looney was the head of North Sea in BP, and we were in for like a couple of weeks, and it was just post Macondo, the tragic incident in the Gulf of Mexico in April 2010, where sadly 11 people lost their lives in a horrendous tragedy. And it would have been sort of September later that year when we were sat in BP's atrium. If anybody's been in that building and they know that big atrium in the center, and Bernard was giving a town hall, and he had invited Jim Cowie, the then vice president of Wells for the North Sea, who had been part of the investigation team on Macondo, to talk a little bit through the findings and what we were changing as a company. And I, as a young graduate, was keen on what influenced me, right? I was, and in my head, I was wondering what was going to change from my standpoint. And Bernard had invited some questions. And my question that I wanted to ask was, Bernard, what's going to change in terms of training, right? Because we were obviously brand new out the box, and that was what we were about to go through. We were about to go through the kind of training program for all drilling engineers, and we'd obviously seen a tragedy which sadly was, contributed to as a consequence of some drilling engineering failings. That's why I was interested to know what was going to change on a training basis. However, the question before me was something which yielded an enormous applause and hilarity from the crowd. So I completely fumbled the ball when the next question was then me. And I just said, oh man, that question was just so good. I just wanted to know more about that. And it was like, Bernard just told me, dude, answered, off, gone. And I thought, oh shit, I've completely fumbled the ball here. I wish I just asked the authentic question that I wanted to ask, because it would have been so much more useful and valuable. So I think that would be my answer to, would I have changed anything? And I remember it being quite a poignant moment, actually. And I guess the message and the moral there is just be authentic. Just, don't try and mimic or copy or do something that you thought somebody else did was good, so you just do that. Be authentic to yourself, and you can't go too wrong, I think.
I think that's a really important message as well. So that's all the questions I have I would like to thank Tristan for your time. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Have a good day.
That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, I'd like to gently encourage you to leave a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts, and share the show with another person. You can also follow me on LinkedIn or via my website, www.michellefraserconsultancy.com. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.